A man in a dark suit steps out of a black diplomatic car in the heart of London. He doesn't smile, doesn't greet anyone. He just walks straight toward a royal guard and pulls a gun. No sirens, no shouting, just a frozen square filled with tourists holding their breath. The guard, dressed in blood-red ceremonial uniform, sits atop a black warhorse, unmoving, unshaken, unarmed, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the crowd, beyond the weapon now pointed at his chest. He doesn't flinch, doesn't blink, doesn't say a word, but what the man with the gun doesn't know is that in exactly 3 minutes, the square will be surrounded, sealed off by the most elite armed response unit under the British Crown. And once that happens, no badge, no rank, no diplomatic immunity will be enough to save him. What made it decorated? U.S. federal agent lose control on foreign soil? Why did he draw a weapon on a silent soldier in full public view? And more importantly, why didn't the soldier react? This is not fiction, not a movie trailer, not a dramatization. This really happened right outside Clarence House. And the most terrifying part? The man who never moved one dot in a world where power is often loud, aggressive, and in your face. One man stood still, said nothing, and proved that real strength doesn't need volume. You're about to hear how a split-second decision shattered a career, sparked a diplomatic scandal, and left the world asking the same question. Who was that soldier? And how did he stay completely still with a loaded gun 6 feet from his chest? Welcome to Tales and Truths, where real stories are told with the depth and drama they deserve. Here, we don't just recount events, we explore the quiet courage behind them. The soldier who stood still while a gun was drawn. The officer who commanded a square without ever raising her voice. The lesson hidden in the silence, stronger than the noise. At Tales and Truths, we believe that the most powerful stories aren't always the loudest. They're the moments of discipline, of character, of calm under fire that speak volumes without shouting. If you're someone who values depth over drama, meaning over mayhem, you've just found your channel. So stay, listen, and reflect. Because the truth isn't just something you hear. It's something you feel. And sometimes it changes you. Tales and Truths. Real stories. Quiet power. Lasting. Impact. It was the kind of October morning that bites through your coat and sinks into your bones. The air sharp, clean, electric with silence. The streets of London were just waking up, but already tourists had begun to gather around the black wrought iron gates of Clarence House. Frost clung to every rail, every rooftop, and every window pane like a fragile breath that refused to leave. Even the pigeons seemed to move with purpose. Beneath the archway, in the very heart of ceremonial ground, sat Lance Sergeant Aidan Faulkner, 29 years old, broad-shouldered, steel-eyed, and silent. He wore the full regalia of the kings. Guard, a living emblem of tradition. A scarlet tunic pressed so sharply it could cut, brass buttons shining like miniature suns, a white leather belt spotless as fresh snow, and black boots so polished they mirrored the gray London sky. His bearskin hat sat at the precise regulation angle, not a single hair out of place. One gloved hand rested on the hilt of a ceremonial saber. The other held the reins of his warhorse. Raven, a towering black stallion whose muscles rippled beneath a coat so dark it seemed to drink in the light. Together, they looked like they'd stepped out of a painting, unmoving, untouchable, eternal. But what the tourists didn't know what their selfies couldn't capture was this. Aidan Faulkner wasn't just a ceremonial figure. He was a combat veteran, forged in fire overseas. 2 tours in Helmand Province. Survived mortar strikes, convoy ambushes, and the kind of nights that change men forever. There was shrapnel in his shoulder doctors had chosen not to remove, buried. So deep, it shifted with the weather. On cold mornings like this, he could feel it move like a ghost under the skin. He didn't talk about what he'd seen, didn't brag about it, didn't wear trauma like a badge of honor. But if you knew what to look for, the controlled breathing, the peripheral awareness, the stillness that's not passive, but honed, you'd know. This man was not just part of the show. He was the reason the show was safe. Aidan Faulkner had once held a dying comrade in his arms, whispering lies of comfort while blood pooled around their boots. He'd gone 48 hours without sleep in forward outposts, where blinking could mean death. And now, he sat like stone atop Raven, in front of 100 tourists who had no idea they were standing in the presence of quiet. Practiced lethal strength. To them, he was just part of the postcard, another fixture of British pageantry. But to the Crown, to the unit that trained him, and to every soldier who ever stood a post in silence, Faulkner was something else entirely. He was discipline made flesh. And as the tourists adjusted their cameras, and children pointed at the horse, and teachers gave hurried lessons on royal traditions, none of them knew that something was already wrong, because 50 meters away, a black sedan with American diplomatic plates was pulling up. No escort, no clearance, no regard for protocol. Inside was a man who would misread everything: the stillness, the uniform, the silence, and in just a few minutes, he would draw a weapon on the wrong person, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and he would learn too late what it really means to test a soldier trained to never move unless ordered. He stepped out of the car like he owned the square, tall, broad, and draped in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than a London flat's monthly rent. Agent Connor Walsh adjusted his sunglasses with one hand and flashed a federal badge. With the other, though, no one had asked to see it. His shoes were mirror polished, his tie razor straight, and his walk impatient. To any average American street, he looked exactly like what he was: a federal agent with too much authority, too little oversight, and a chip on his shoulder the size of a federal building. He was angry. Some internal security briefing hadn't gone his way. There was talk of enhanced diplomatic sensitivities, host nation respect, and mutual protocols. Words that meant nothing to a man who had spent 15 years chasing gang leaders in Detroit and drug lords. In Minneapolis, places where you kicked in doors, pointed guns, and got answers. Fast. Now, he was in London, and all he saw were people in funny hats, overly polite language, and a city obsessed with ceremony. It irritated him, but nothing irritated him more than the man on the horse. Agent Walsh had been standing there for 10 minutes, watching the royal guard like a hawk, and something about that stillness, it got under his skin. The absolute calm, the way tourists whispered reverently instead of laughing, like they were in church. It made Connor feel small, and he didn't like feeling small. He walked right up to the base of the guards, positioned closer than any civilian dared to go, and cleared his throat with a kind of authority designed to provoke. Agent Connor Walsh, FBI, I need you to shift position. Security assessment in progress. You're blocking a critical sight line. No response. Not a blink. Not a glance. Sergeant Aidan Faulkner remained motionless, eyes fixed on a point far beyond Connor's presence, as if the man didn't exist at all. You hear me, soldier? Connor said louder, stepping even closer. I said move. Still nothing. A couple in the crowd nearby began whispering. One Scottish woman, audible over the hush, muttered, "He's not allowed to move, love." That's the point. That made it worse. Connor's jaw clenched. Being corrected, especially in public, was a trigger. He wasn't here to be mocked or ignored. He was federal law enforcement. He was supposed to command attention, not be treated like a tourist with an attitude. Look, he snapped, I'm not asking for a parade. Just step aside for 5 minutes so we can do our job. Still nothing. Faulkner sat taller now, if that was even possible, his posture straightening by fractions. His hand still resting on the saber, unmoved. Connor leaned in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What's the matter? Your batteries run out? This some kind of wind-up toy in red wool? A few tourists laughed, uncomfortably, but the mood was shifting. It wasn't funny anymore. It was tense, strange. The energy had shifted from awkward to dangerous. And still Faulkner didn't move. A little. Girl whispered, "Why is the American man being mean to the soldier?" Her father didn't answer. Connor's voice dropped an octave, no longer professional, now personal. You think you're better than me, standing there like some glorified mannequin while real men do real work? He stepped forward too close, now his finger jabbing just inches from Faulkner's chest. I bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes in the real world. And that was the moment. That quiet, invisible threshold where misunderstanding turns into something irreversible. Because Connor Walsh had just crossed a line. He didn't know it yet, but everyone around him could feel it. The tension in the air wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was warning. And 3 minutes from now, the entire square would change. Forever. The square was silent. Connor Walsh didn't notice it yet, but the laughter had stopped. The tourists weren't smiling anymore. Phones were recording, now held low at first, then higher, trembling in hands that suddenly felt less certain. Parents held children tighter. Couples stepped back. Something in the air had changed, but the agent kept going. He was too deep into the confrontation now, too far gone to back down. In his mind, this wasn't about protocol anymore. It was personal. A power struggle. One he refused to lose. You really think this is strength? He sneered. You think standing there like a wax figure while the world moves around you makes you important? Still, Faulkner didn't move, didn't blink, didn't twitch. Just sat tall on Raven, unmoved by insult, unshaken by proximity. His grip on the reins tightened slightly, so slight it might have been invisible. Unless you knew what to look for. Walsh mistook it for defiance. I've dealt with armed men. In war zones, he growled, stepping even closer. Terrorists who were more responsive than this. At least they had the decency to shoot back. Raven shifted just one hoof, just a snort, but it was enough to catch the crowd's attention. The horse sensed it. Something was coming. The tension in the air had teeth now. Walsh saw the movement. Smiled an ugly, sideways kind of smile. What's the matter? Your little pony getting nervous for you? And then it happened. Started subtle, his hand sliding to the edge of his suit jacket. At first, it looked casual. Maybe he was adjusting his coat, maybe reaching for a phone. But the movement was too familiar, too practiced. It had weight. Then. The fabric lifted. And the shoulder holster was there, gleaming black, fully loaded, tucked tight against his ribs. The crowd tensed. Someone gasped. A small child whimpered. But still Faulkner didn't move. Walsh's hand went inside the jacket, slow and deliberate. And then he pulled the gun. Not fully, not raised, but visible. Low, angled, purposeful. A threat. The square exploded not in sound, but in energy. Panic surged like a wave. People ducked behind benches. Mothers shielded children. An elderly woman dropped her handbag. Coins scattered across the cobblestones like shrapnel. A tourist shouted, "He's got a gun." Another screamed, "Call the police," but no one ran. Not yet, because even in their terror, they were witnessing something they didn't understand. Something surreal. A man had just drawn a weapon on a ceremonial guard in the heart of London, in broad daylight, on crown ground. And the guard still hadn't moved. "Final warning," Walsh said, voice low, flat, confident. "You move, or I will." He didn't shout. He didn't shake. His tone was the kind used by men who'd pulled this move before and gotten their way. Raven shifted again, just a single deliberate step forward. No panic, no flinch, just trained control. Muscle responding to instinct. Instinct responding to threat. Faulkner's hand flexed on the reins. Still not a word. Still not a blink dot somewhere, far beyond what the crowd could see. A quiet alarm had already been triggered, not the kind with flashing lights, a kind that means one thing only. Royal Guard is in immediate danger, and when that alarm is sounded, centuries of tradition don't hesitate, they respond. But Connor Walsh, he never heard the alarm, never saw it coming, because in his world, power meant volume, threats, and guns. In this world, it meant something very different. And now, the square wasn't silent because of shock. It was waiting. He never heard them coming. There were no sirens, no barking orders, no blinding lights, just a low, bone-deep rumble like thunder buried beneath cobblestone that seemed to rise from the ground itself. And then came the sounds, doors slamming, boots hitting stone in perfect rhythm, controlled, precise, inevitable. Out of alleys, behind closed gates, and from concealed access points within the palace complex, they emerged black Range Rovers, matte-finished and unmarked except for discreet insignias that only those with military clearance would recognize. 3 vehicles. No fanfare. No hurry. The first stopped 20 meters from the square. The second blocked off the road leading to the U.S. Embassy. The third sealed the last available escape route. Connor Walsh finally turned his head, just in time to see the convoy surround him like a chessboard snapping shut. The doors opened, and out stepped the palace, armed response unit. They moved like liquid steel fluid, but unrelenting. Black tactical gear, rifles held low but ready, expressions unreadable. No panic, no shouting, just complete, total control. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was the statement. Connor's weapon was still in his hand, now trembling slightly. He turned, eyes darting, looking for backup that wasn't coming, a way out that didn't exist. And then she appeared. From behind the lead vehicle, Captain Celia Hart walked forward, hands clasped behind her back, posture immaculate. Mid-40s, Royal Military Police, eyes like frozen steel, voice calm enough to silence a riot. Agent Walsh. She called across the square, her tone clear but not loud. Place your weapon on the ground. Put your hands above your head. He hesitated. I'm a federal agent, he shouted, trying to sound confident. I have diplomatic immunity. You can't. You drew a loaded firearm, she interrupted, stepping closer, on a serving member of the British Armed Forces, during active ceremonial duty on Crown property. That makes this our jurisdiction. The silence that followed hit harder than any shouted command. She took another step forward, perfectly calm. You have exactly 10 seconds to comply, or my team is authorized to use whatever force is necessary. Connor's world shrank. He looked around at the rifles now trained on him, at the tourists staring in stunned disbelief, at the cell phones catching every second of what was quickly becoming an international incident. And then he looked back at Faulkner. The guard was still on his horse, still gripping the reins, still staring past the chaos like none of it existed. Not a single muscle moved, not even his eyes. That broke something inside Connor Walsh. He didn't even flinch. He muttered, almost to himself, Captain Hart. Heard it. Of course he didn't, she replied coldly. He's trained not to flinch. You, on the other hand, seem trained to escalate what you don't understand. Connor's shoulders sagged, his hand opened. The pistol clattered to the stone with a sound that echoed like a gavel. I surrender. The response team moved instantly, 2 soldiers disarmed, and restrained him with quiet efficiency, zip-tying his wrists and securing his badge. Through it all, he kept looking back at Faulkner. I had a gun pointed at him, and he didn't even blink. The officer beside him gave a small, measured reply. "That's not a flaw," he said quietly. "That's the point." The square remained silent utterly, profoundly silent long after the handcuffs clicked shut. Connor Walsh stood motionless now, hands bound behind his back. His once confident posture collapsed into something smaller, humbler. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't protest. The federal agent who had walked into the square thinking authority came from a badge. Had learned otherwise. As the armed response unit began to escort him to the waiting vehicle, the tourists watched. In reverent stillness, still recording, still processing what they had just witnessed. Not a single shot had been fired, but something permanent had just occurred. Captain Celia Hart walked beside the disgraced agent without a word, until at the vehicle's door, she paused and turned to him. "You came here today thinking your weapon made you powerful," she said, her voice quite firm. "But power doesn't come from what you carry. It comes from what you can withstand." She motioned toward Sergeant Faulkner. He stood in complete stillness, not because he was helpless, but because he didn't need to move. Because discipline isn't weakness, it's strength restrained. And today you mistook that for silence. Walsh couldn't reply. He just lowered his head. As the convoy rolled away. A remarkable thing happened. It started small, a slow clap from an elderly man near the front of the crowd. Former military, perhaps, judging by the pin on his lapel. He stood straight, shoulders square, and clapped with deliberate, solemn rhythm. Then others joined. Scottish couple who had sipped coffee that morning. A Japanese tour group. A young father holding his daughter who had asked why the American man was yelling. Even the teenager with the phone, who had captured the entire confrontation, lowered her camera and began to applaud. They weren't cheering for an arrest. They weren't clapping for punishment or spectacle. They were acknowledging something rare, something quietly magnificent. The strength of a man who faced a loaded weapon and never broke posture. The resolve of someone who could have responded but chose not to. Someone who represented not just the uniform, but the very idea of what it meant to wear it. And through it all, Sergeant Aidan Faulkner never reacted. He didn't turn his head, didn't shift his weight, didn't acknowledge the applause in any way. He simply remained, as still as he had always been. Not for show, not for praise, but because that was the job, because that's what tradition demanded. And because some men are built to guard things the rest of us take for granted. By the afternoon, flowers had appeared at the edge of the ceremonial barrier. Small notes from children, handwritten thank yous from tourists, drawings, messages of respect. The palace issued a brief, official statement. An incident occurred. No one was harmed. The matter is under investigation. The American embassy issued its own. We regret the events of this morning. We are cooperating fully. But the people who had been there, the ones who had seen it unfold, didn't need press releases. They had witnessed something real. Not violence. Not spectacle. Character. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't shout or swagger. The kind that simply stands when others would collapse. Now we want to hear from you. What would you have done in that moment? Do you believe real strength is found in action or in restraint? Leave us a comment below and tell us what this story made you feel, what it made you think about leadership, power, and discipline. Your voice matters, and your insight could change how someone else sees the world. Was the guard's silence weakness, or the ultimate form of control? We read every single comment, so take a moment, share your thoughts, and join the conversation. Because these stories don't just speak, they ask.